The banker stared at the paper like it was written in blood. His hands were shaking, a fine tremor that started in his fingertips and was now rattling the expensive ink pen he held. In 30 years of managing the finances of this territory, he'd seen desperate men do desperate things. He'd seen families sell off heirlooms and ranchers sell their last head of cattle. He'd never seen anything like this. Across the mahogany desk, Tobias Crow sat perfectly still. The sickness had wasted him down to bone and sinew, but his eyes were clear, clear and calm, too calm for a man giving away his entire world. The banker cleared his throat, but the sound came out like a dry rasp. "Mr. Crow," he whispered, leaning forward, "this can't be right." He tapped a trembling finger on the price listed on the deed of sale. A single stark number followed by a dollar sign. $1, not 1,000, not even 100. One single dollar for the Crow Ranch, the largest and most prosperous spread in 3 counties. $40,000 of prime grazing land, river access, and cattle, all being signed away for less than the cost of a bullet. "This land is worth a fortune, Tobias. Your family bled for this ranch for 30 years. Why?" Tobias didn't even look at the paper. His gaze was fixed on the window, on the dusty street outside. "Because, Henry," Tobias interrupted, his voice surprisingly strong, a remnant of the man he used to be. "Some debts can't be paid in dollars." The banker followed his gaze. Outside, standing in the long morning shadow of the saloon, a figure stood motionless. An Apache woman. She was older than the hills, her face a road map of hard seasons, her hair streaked with silver. She wasn't looking at the bank, not really. She was just watching, waiting, as if she knew exactly what was happening inside. The banker's pen hovered over the document. Signing this felt like a crime. It felt like madness. This town had spent generations pushing the Apache further and further away, fighting over every scrap of land and water. And now Tobias Crow, one of their own, was giving it all back. But Tobias wasn't looking at the papers anymore. He wasn't even looking at the woman. His eyes were fixed on something distant, something only he could see on the far horizon. And for the first time in months, the dying man smiled. What the banker didn't know, what nobody in town knew, was that this wasn't charity. This wasn't the rambling of a sick mind. This was the final move in a game that had started 30 years ago. A promise made by a young, half-frozen cowboy that would haunt him to his final breath. And at sunrise tomorrow, when 70 Apache warriors would appear on that land in complete, terrifying silence, the truth would finally surface. A truth so powerful it would shatter everything anyone thought they knew about Tobias Crow, about the Apache, and about what really happened the night the old chief disappeared. The horses were just beyond the tree line. Tobias didn't need to see them to know they were there. He could hear them. The soft snort of a nervous pony, the scrape of a hoof on stone. He counted 12 distinct sounds, 12 riders, waiting in the darkness like patient predators. They were early. A soft knock echoed through the small cabin. It wasn't the heavy, angry pounding of a townsman. It wasn't the urgent rap of Doc Harrison on a late-night call. This was different, quiet, respectful, expected. Tobias rose slowly from his chair, his joints screaming in protest with every movement. He shuffled to the door and pulled it open. The woman standing on his porch looked just as he remembered, and nothing like he remembered at all. 30 years had passed since he'd last seen Ayana. Her hair, once as black as a raven's wing, was now streaked with the silver of wisdom. But her eyes were the same, dark, fierce, and carrying an intelligence that could cut a man to the bone. "You kept your word," she said. It wasn't a question. "Took me long enough," Tobias rasped, stepping aside to let her in. The cabin seemed to shrink with her inside it, the air suddenly charged with the weight of unspoken history. Her presence filled the space with memories he'd spent a lifetime trying to bury. Ayana's gaze flickered from his gaunt face to the simple wooden box sitting on the table, then back again. "The sickness is winning," she observed. "Doc says I've got maybe 2 months, 3 if I'm stubborn." Tobias managed a weak, lopsided smile. "Always was stubborn." She didn't smile back. She walked to the window, peering out at the darkness where her riders were hidden, her people, her responsibility, now that her father was gone. "The town will not understand what you have done," she said, her back to him. They will think you've betrayed them. The town never understood much of anything. Tobias joined her at the window, their shoulders almost touching. The familiar scent of sage and leather filled his senses, a ghost from another life. But they'll understand soon enough. When the sun rises, when your people take their rightful place on that land, the truth will be harder to ignore. Ayana turned to face him fully, and for a fleeting moment, the 30 years between them evaporated. She was the chief's daughter again, the girl who had argued with the elders to save his life during the bitter winter of 42. He was the young cowboy again, swearing an oath he was terrified he'd never be able to keep. "My father," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "He never stopped believing you would honor the promise." A lump formed in Tobias's throat. I should have done it sooner, while he was still alive to see it. He knew. Ayana's hand reached for the wooden box on the table, her fingers hesitating just above its worn surface. "But there are still those who remember the old ways," she murmured. "Who remember what this land was, before the fences and the cattle came?" Through the window, they could see them, small flickers of light, appearing one by one down in the town. Torches. Word of the sale was spreading from the bank, slithering through the saloons and homesteads like a snake. And with it, anger was building like a storm cloud on the horizon. Ayana lifted the wooden box with a reverence Tobias hadn't seen in her since she was a girl handling her father's ceremonial pipe. Her long, slender fingers traced the carved symbols on its lid. Symbols that told a story of her people, a story most white men would never, ever understand. "You've kept this safe all these years," she said. "Your father trusted me with more than just his daughter's life that winter." Tobias eased himself back into his worn armchair, the weight of his memories pressing down on him, heavier than any sickness. He could see it all so clearly: the blinding snow, the gnawing hunger, the certainty of his own death. "I was 19, he began, his voice barely a whisper, "starving and half frozen. Your people found me collapsed near the sacred spring. Most of the warriors, they wanted to leave me for the wolves. But my father saw something different," Ayana said. She opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a beaded necklace. The intricate pattern of blues and whites seemed to glow in the lamplight, each bead a silent word in an ancient language. "He said you had the eyes of someone who understood loss," she continued, lifting the necklace from the box. Tobias nodded slowly, the memory sharp and painful. "My family, they'd been killed by raiders the month before. My folks, my two little sisters. I was the only one who got away. I was all that was left." Chief Tahatan, her father, had looked at him not with pity, but with a deep, unsettling recognition. "He recognized that emptiness," Tobias said. "He told me it was the same look his own people carried in their eyes, after the soldiers came and burned their winter stores." Outside, the low murmur of angry voices was growing louder, closer. Tobias could pick out the booming voice of Samuel Briggs, a man he'd known for 20 years. Briggs was organizing them, stoking their fear into a righteous fire, calling for action before the Apache could take possession at dawn. "That winter," Tobias continued, his voice dropping even lower, forcing Ayana to lean in, "your father made me an offer. He would teach me to survive, to read the tracks, to find the water, to understand this land the way his people did. In return, I would make him a promise. A promise that if you ever prospered on this territory," Ayana finished for him, "you would ensure his people always had a place to return to." She held the necklace up to the light. "This belonged to my grandmother. The pattern tells the story of our people's connection to this land, going back 7 generations. When my father gave it to you, he wasn't just giving you a gift. He was making me family," Tobias said, his hand instinctively going to his chest, to the spot where the necklace had rested for 3 decades. "I wore it under my shirt for 30 years, he confessed. "Every fence I built, every head of cattle I branded, every dollar I put in that bank. I knew. I knew none of it was really mine. I was just holding it in trust." Crash! The sound of shattering glass ripped through the night. Someone had thrown a rock, a bottle, at a neighbor's window. The poison was spreading. The fear was turning to violence. Ayana carefully placed the necklace back in its box and closed the lid. At sunrise, 70 of our finest warriors will come, she said, her voice steady and clear. Not to claim what you have given us, but to honor the promise made between two fathers. Tobias felt the sting of tears he'd held back for a lifetime. Tears of grief, of regret, of a profound and terrible relief. I never had children, Ayana, he choked out. Never had a wife, never had anyone to pass this land to. But I always knew. I always knew it belonged to your people. Through the window they saw the torches gathering in the town square. A sea of angry lights, moving as one, moving toward them. The confrontation that had been simmering for 30 years was about to boil over. The mob reached the cabin just after midnight. There were 23 of them, faces illuminated by the flickering torchlight, twisted with the kind of righteous hatred that had poisoned this territory for decades. They carried rifles and grudges in equal measure. Samuel Briggs was at the front, his face a mask of fury. "Crow!" he bellowed, pounding a heavy fist on the wooden door. "Come out here and explain yourself, you damn traitor!" Tobias pushed himself up from his chair, his body weak, but his will like iron. But before he could take a step, Ayana placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let me," she said. Her voice was calm, but her eyes held a fire that could melt steel. She moved toward the door with the quiet, unshakable confidence of someone born to lead. When she pulled the door open, the mob fell instantly silent. The sight of her stopped them cold. Few of them had ever seen an Apache woman this close. None of them had expected to find one inside Tobias Crow's home. She stood in the doorway, her back straight, her chin high, unflinching under the glare of 24 hostile men. "You have business with my friend?" she asked. Her English was perfect, precise, and carried an authority that shamed their crude shouting. Briggs was the first to find his voice, his rifle rising slightly. "Your friend just signed away half the county to your savage tribe. We won't stand for it." "What my friend has done," Ayana replied, her voice dangerously calm, "is return stolen property to its rightful owners. But I understand your confusion. White men often struggle with the concept of justice." The insult hit its mark. A few men surged forward, their knuckles white on their rifles. But then Tobias appeared in the doorway behind her. His gaunt frame looked frail, but he stood with a dignity that commanded respect. "Boys," he said, his voice raspy but carrying across the yard, "you're trespassing, and you're disturbing a dying man's last peaceful night on this earth." "Peaceful?" Briggs spat the word like venom. "You think we'll have peace when Apache warriors are riding across our lands? When they're camped where our children play?" Tobias's eyes moved slowly over the crowd, studying the faces of men he'd known for years. Men he'd shared drinks with, men who'd bought his cattle, men who'd once called him a friend. "Tell me, Samuel," he asked, "what is it you think they'll do to this town?" "Raid us, kill us, burn everything we've built," another man shouted from the back. "Is that what you would do?" Tobias asked quietly. The simple question hung in the cold night air, unanswered and deeply uncomfortable. "If someone returned what was stolen from your family, would you respond by raiding and killing?" Before anyone could answer, a new sound cut through the tension, the soft thud of unshod hooves on dry earth. Behind the mob, more riders were approaching. Not angry townsmen. These were Apache warriors, moving with the fluid, unnerving silence of ghosts. They stopped just at the edge of the torchlight, a line of dark silhouettes on horseback, neither advancing nor retreating, just watching. Briggs saw them and his rifle came up higher, his fear now raw and exposed. "They're surrounding us." "No," Ayana said softly, her eyes on her warriors. "They are protecting us." She turned her gaze back to the terrified mob. "All of us." The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves, making the torchlight dance and flicker across the hard, frightened faces of the townsmen. What did she mean? Protecting them? From what? Tobias stepped forward, past Ayana, addressing the crowd with the absolute authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. "In 6 hours," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction, "at sunrise you'll understand what I've really done here. You'll see that some promises are worth more than land, more than money." He took a ragged breath. "They're worth everything." And from the darkness, from all directions, came the sound of more horses, hundreds of them, a rhythmic rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet, promising that the dawn would bring answers no one was prepared for. Dawn broke like a blood orange, splitting open across the valley. The townsmen had kept their vigil all night, their fear and anger slowly curdling into a grim, exhausted resolve. They stood with their rifles ready, eyes scanning the horizon, expecting a wave of warriors to come thundering down on them with war cries and violence. What they witnessed instead was something none of them would ever forget. As the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern ridge, 70 Apache warriors appeared. They didn't ride into view. They simply materialized. One moment the ridge was empty, the next it was lined with them, sitting motionless on their horses, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun. They formed a silent, unbroken line that stretched across the entire horizon. Not a single voice was raised. Not a single weapon was visible. They simply sat and watched and waited. Samuel Briggs slowly lowered his rifle, the anger on his face replaced by a deep, unnerving confusion. "What are they doing? Why aren't they attacking?" Ayana stepped forward from the cabin porch, her voice carrying with startling clarity in the crisp morning air. "They are paying their respects," she announced. 70 warriors for 70 years of exile from this land. Each man you see carries the memory of a decade of displacement. Tobias emerged from the cabin, moving with a slow, deliberate purpose that defied his illness. In his hands, he carried the wooden box. He opened it and for the first time revealed its contents to the entire town. The beaded necklace caught the morning light, shimmering with an inner fire. 30 years ago, Tobias said, his voice stronger than anyone had heard it in years. Chief Tahatan saved my life when I was lost and broken. He asked for nothing in return, nothing except a promise. A promise that if I ever prospered on this land, I would remember where that prosperity truly came from. Doc Harrison pushed his way through the stunned crowd, his medical bag in hand. He'd seen Tobias just yesterday. The man should barely be able to stand, let alone command a crowd like this. It was impossible. "This ranch," Tobias continued, his voice ringing across the silent valley, "this fortune, this life I built, none of it was ever really mine. I was just a caretaker, holding it in trust until the rightful owners could reclaim their home." As he spoke, the warriors on the ridge began to move, not down the hillside as the townsmen feared, but off their horses. With a synchronized, fluid grace, they all dismounted as one. Each man reached into his saddlebags and removed bundles of sage, eagle feathers, and small carved stones. They began to arrange them on the ground in careful, intricate patterns. "They are performing the ceremony of homecoming," Ayana explained softly, her gaze fixed on the ridge. "It has not been performed on this land in over 70 years. They are blessing the earth, asking it to remember them." Mrs. Patterson, who had been clutching her husband's arm in terror all morning, found herself taking a step forward. There was no threat in what the warriors were doing. There was only a profound, heartbreaking reverence. But as the ceremony on the ridge continued, Tobias suddenly swayed on his feet. His hand flew to his chest, his face contorting in a spasm of pain. The wooden box slipped from his trembling fingers, falling to the ground. The precious necklace and its sacred contents scattered in the dust. Dr. Harrison lunged forward as Tobias collapsed to his knees, but Ayana was faster. She was at his side in an instant, her arms supporting his frail body as she knelt in the dirt beside him. With her free hand, she began gathering the scattered beads and feathers, her movements gentle and sure. "The ceremony must be completed," Tobias whispered, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His eyes, however, were still fierce with determination. "They need to know the whole truth." With Ayana's help, he struggled back to his feet. Together, they faced the crowd of townsfolk who had come for a war, but were now witnessing a history they had never known. Chief Tahatan had 70 warriors under his command when the territorial government forced our people from this valley, Ayana announced, her voice rising to meet the morning sun. Today, 70 descendants of those warriors have returned, not as conquerors, but as family, coming home. On the ridge, the warriors had finished their arrangements. The sacred items formed patterns that seemed to mirror the very contours of the land itself. Then, in perfect unison, they turned and began to walk down the hillside. They left their horses behind. They were approaching on foot, a sign of peace known to all tribes. Samuel Briggs still held his rifle, but his hands were shaking uncontrollably. "I don't understand any of this," he stammered. "What does it mean for us? For our families?" Tobias straightened his back, drawing on some last hidden reserve of strength. "It means the same thing it's always meant, Samuel, that this land is big enough for all of us, if we stop trying to own what was never ours to begin with." The first of the warriors reached the bottom of the hill. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with silver threading through his long black hair. He walked directly to Tobias, stopped 3 feet away, and spoke in his native tongue, his voice low and respectful. Ayana translated. "He says his grandfather was among the men who found you dying in the snow 30 years ago." She paused, her own voice catching. "He says his grandfather spoke often of the young white man who cried for his lost family with the same sound an Apache child makes." More warriors approached, each stopping at a respectful distance, each speaking a few quiet words in their language. One by one, Ayana translated, and with each translation, a new piece of a secret history was revealed, leaving the townspeople utterly speechless. "This one," she said, her voice trembling, "his father remembered you helping to bury the Apache children who died during the forced march west. This one's uncle told him how you shared your winter supplies when our people were starving. This one says his grandfather taught him your name in our language. Not Tobias Crow. They called you the crow who keeps promises." Tears were streaming freely down Tobias's weathered cheeks now. For 3 decades, he had carried the weight of his promise alone, believing it was his solitary burden. He never knew. He never knew that while he was remembering them, the Apache people had been remembering him, telling stories of the one white man who had shown them kindness when the world had shown them nothing but cruelty. "The silence," he whispered, turning to Ayana with a sudden dawning comprehension. "That's why they came in silence. This isn't a taking, it's a reunion." But as the sun climbed higher, as the beautiful, heartbreaking ceremony reached its crescendo, Tobias felt his legs give way again. This time, when he fell, he didn't get back up. His time was running out, and there was still one final devastating truth that needed to be told before he could rest. Doc Harrison knelt beside him, his fingers searching for a pulse that was growing weaker by the second. Tobias struggled to speak, his breathing a shallow, painful rasp. But his eyes, they were locked on Ayana, filled with a desperate, burning intensity. "There's something else," he whispered, his voice so faint it was nearly lost in the morning wind. "Something I never told you about that winter." Ayana leaned closer, her hand finding his, her hair falling like a dark curtain around them. All around, the 70 warriors stood in a silent, respectful circle. Beyond them, the townspeople watched, their old hatred completely gone, replaced by a profound sense of awe. They knew they were witnessing a moment that would change their valley forever. "Your father?" Tobias gasped, each word costing him the last of his life's energy. "He didn't just save my life, Ayana. He saved my soul." He paused, fighting for one more breath. "When I told him about my family, my parents, my 2 little sisters, all of them killed by raiders, he shared something with me, a secret he had told no one else, and it changed everything." The crowd pressed closer, drawn in by the power of this final confession. "Chief Tahatan told me that his own son, his only son, had been killed by white soldiers just 3 months before they found me," Tobias whispered. "A boy about my age. His name was Tokala. He was his father's heir." He fought for another breath, his grip on Ayana's hand tightening. "He said that when he looked at me, a white boy dying in the snow, he didn't see an enemy. He saw a chance to honor his son's memory by saving a life instead of taking one." Ayana let out a sob, a sound of pure, heart-wrenching grief and understanding. "You never knew," she wept. "You never knew about Tokala." "I knew his name," Tobias said softly. "Your father spoke of him every single day that winter. He taught me to hunt the way Tokala hunted. He showed me how to read the land the way Tokala read it. By the time spring came, I finally understood what he had done." His voice broke. He hadn't just saved me, Ayanna. He had made me his son. Samuel Briggs let his rifle fall from his hands. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. Around him, other townsmen did the same, the weapons suddenly feeling obscene and heavy. The truth, in its awesome and terrible power, was finally clear. That's why the promise meant everything, Tobias continued, his voice fading to a whisper. It wasn't just about stolen land. It was about a father keeping faith with his lost son. It was about making sure the next generation would have the home that Takala never lived to see. Doc Harrison looked grimly at Ayanna. His heart is failing. He doesn't have much time. But Tobias wasn't finished. With one last monumental effort, he reached inside his dusty shirt. He pulled out a small, worn leather pouch that had hung around his neck for 30 years. Tokala's, he breathed, pressing the pouch into Ayanna's hand. Your father, he cut a lock of his hair before the burial, and he gave it to me. He said it would remind me that some bonds are stronger than blood. A profound and sacred silence fell over the valley. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The weight of 3 decades of loyalty, of loss, and of a love that transcended race and blood settled over them all. As the sun reached its highest point in the sky, Tobias Crow took his final, peaceful breath. Ayanna's hand was in his, and 70 Apache warriors stood as his honor guard, witnesses to the completion of a promise that had defined his entire life. Doc Harrison gently closed his friend's eyes, then stood to address the silent, grieving crowd. He's gone, but he died a good death. He died knowing he kept his word. The 70 warriors, as if responding to some unspoken signal, began to move. But they didn't move toward the cabin to claim it. They didn't start setting up camps on the fields. Instead, they began to work. Some of them walked to the ranch house and the barns, their keen eyes spotting loose boards and broken fences. They found Tobias's tools and immediately started making repairs. Others moved toward the neglected fields, testing the soil, pulling weeds, preparing the earth for a spring planting. A third group walked calmly toward the cattle, who had grown thin and restless during Tobias's illness, and began tending to them with an expert's touch. Samuel Briggs watched, his mouth agape. He saw Apache hands, hands he had been taught to fear his entire life, performing the same tasks he and his neighbors did every single day. What are they doing? He asked Ayanna, his voice full of disbelief. What Tobias would have wanted, she replied, carefully tucking the leather pouch containing Tokala's hair into her dress. They are not taking this land from your community. They are making it productive again. This ranch will provide for both our peoples. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her face hesitant but hopeful. You mean you're not driving us out? Ayanna looked at her, and for the first time since she had arrived, a genuine warm smile touched her lips. Tobias understood something your town forgot long ago. This land doesn't belong to any one person. It is vast enough for everyone if we learn to work together instead of against each other. Over the next few hours, something miraculous began to happen. One by one, the townspeople started to drift forward. First, a man offered an Apache warrior a hammer. Then a woman brought a bucket of fresh water from the well for the men working on the fields. Soon, tools were being shared. Advice on a stubborn fence post was being exchanged, and the heavy silence was replaced by the sounds of a community coming together. The fear that had poisoned the valley for decades began to dissolve under the hot afternoon sun. By evening, Samuel Briggs found himself leaning against a corral fence he had just spent 3 hours repairing. Beside him stood one of the Apache warriors. I was wrong, Samuel admitted quietly, not looking at the man. I was wrong about all of this. The warrior, who spoke a little English, nodded thoughtfully, his gaze on the setting sun. Fear makes enemies of neighbors, he said. Work makes neighbors of strangers. 3 months later, the Crow Ranch was a place no one in the territory could have imagined. It was a thriving partnership, a joint venture between Apache and white families. Ayanna now managed the operation from Tobias's cabin, her wisdom as deep and steady as the river that ran through the land. Most of the warriors returned to their main settlement, but 12 stayed on permanently, their families joining them, creating the first truly integrated community the region had ever seen. They buried Tobias Crow on the hill overlooking the ranch. His grave was marked by a simple wooden cross, and beside it, a circle of Apache prayer stones. The wooden box containing the sacred necklace was buried with him, its long journey finally over. The dying cowboy's impossible sail had accomplished what decades of treaties and violence never could. It had brought two peoples together, not through force, but through a promise of a shared future, built on mutual respect and common ground. And sometimes in the deep silence of the valley at dawn, when the morning mist rose from the fields where Apache and settler children now played together, people would swear they could hear it, a faint whisper on the wind, the sound of old promises finally being kept. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where justice finds a way, even in the harshest corners of the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Your support means everything to us.